The first humans known to inhabit the Los Angeles basin, including what is now the City of Beverly Hills, were the descendants of great ancient hunters who crossed from Asia into North America via the Bering Strait.
The earliest humans to arrive in what is now Los Angeles County we call the early Millingstone people, and these are folks that probably arrived about 8,500 years ago. There's two theories as to how the earliest American Indians got to California. One has them coming down through the heart of the continent, following what is referred to as the ice-free corridor between the two massive ice sheets towards the end of the last of the great ice ages. The second theory has them coming down an exposed seabed now underwater and perhaps 200 feet below present sea level that would have been exposed if the great ice masses were locked up in the polar ice caps. What happened to the earliest people? It's entirely possible that they were supplanted by a whole series of later arrivals that we don't even know the names of. Each group probably absorbed a certain amount of the culture of the preceding group and then in turn was absorbed itself.
The people encountered by the Spanish are known today as the Gabrielino or Tongva Indians. They were originally part of a large migration of Shoshonean people from the Great Basin area of Utah and Nevada into Southern California that began about 2,000 years ago. Conquering, displacing, and absorbing the local peoples, they settled a large area from the desert to the coast, including the Los Angeles basin.
The Tongva not only were, but are the indigenous people of the LA County, Orange County basin, arriving here somewhere around between 2,000 to 5,000 BC, coming out of the Great Basin Desert and coming through the Great Passes and occupying the lands that we now know as LA, but which we knew as Tovangar, the world. Word Tongva means basically the people of the land. It can also be translated to mean human or people as such. It was a word that was rarely used. I mean, you didn't walk up to someone and say, "Hello, are you human?" The individual took his identity from his own village. Here we are in the village of Chokishingna. So I would call myself, if I were from this village, Chokishingnavit. Rarely would I say, I am Tongva, because that would be like saying simply, I'm a human being, a member of the land.
The Gabrielinos, or Tongva, although basically hunter-gatherers, had built a complex society.
The organization of Tongva society was basically a hierarchy. At the very top you had the Tomeyar, which means the chief. This is a hereditary position handed down from father to son. However, if there were no son, and if there were a daughter, then it would be handed down from father to daughter.
You also had religious practitioners that were considered to be superior to people that were not as, shall we say, conversant with the supernatural. But you didn't have a rigid division into social classes like some people think of in terms of other American Indian societies.
The Tongva were a deeply spiritual society, highly ritualized in their yearly activities. The year revolved around four great ceremonies, the two solstices and the two equinoxes. Along with these four great ceremonies were these such events as the mourning ceremony, which was the most sacred event of the year. That's mourning as in to mourn the dead. Another great ceremony that was very special and different from the four solar festivals was the puberty festival. And the final great ceremony that was special and obviously was not a yearly event was when a chief was elevated to his or her position.
The Tongva, or Gabrielino as they came to be called by the Spanish, were not the first to come and make the Los Angeles basin their home, and they would certainly not be the last. Soon wave after wave of other peoples would arrive, settle, and fight to claim a part of what is now known as the California Dream. It is a process that continues to this day and has brought with it a richness and diversity the likes of which the world has never known. Colonization began in 1769 with an expedition led by Gaspar de Portola. The Portola expedition, accompanied by Franciscan Padre Junipero Serra, established frontier outposts in San Diego and Monterey. In 1771, the Mission San Gabriel was established in what is now the Los Angeles Basin. The Spanish, thinking the Gabrieleno to be pagan savages, set out on a program to civilize them. The Gabrieleno fought the Spanish, but with no knowledge of organized warfare, and only bows and arrows as weapons, they proved no match for the disciplined Spanish soldiers armed with muskets.
In the very beginning, there were revolts. When Father Serra established the first mission in San Diego in 1769, within the first month there was open revolt. In 1771, when San Gabriel was established down at Sancagna, within the first month there was open revolt against Spanish atrocities.
If caught, runaway Indians were severely punished, generally by lashing. Though the missionaries may have thought of themselves as saving souls, brutality, forced labor, and even rape were common. The Spanish also brought with them many diseases for which the Gabrieleno had no immunity. The mission system would continue in California until the 1830s, when the newly independent nation of Mexico would pass laws to confiscate the land then held by the Catholic Church and redistribute it among the local Indians. In practice, however, most of the land was divided into parcels and sold to private citizens, ushering in the era of the Rancho. One of these parcels, Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas, would one day become a city renowned around the world, Beverly Hills. Rodeo de las Aguas, the future site of the city of Beverly Hills, finally passed to Maria Rita Valdez. A widow with 8 children, the title would not only help Dona Maria and her family to live, but to live well. For his service to King Charles III of Spain, Maria's father, Eugenio Valdez, received over 4,000 acres of land in the New World. This land passed to Maria on her father's death.
It would have taken Maria Rita Valdez 10 years to achieve a clear title because of exactly the bureaucracies that were now part of the government of Mexico.
At this time, in the early 19th century, many of these settlers were given this land so they could, of course, cultivate it and settle the area for Spain.
Land grants came in every size, shape imaginable. It depended on what was being requested. If someone found a piece of land that they thought they could successfully work and be able to use properly, they would measure it out themselves, come to the government with a map usually that they had made themselves that stated these are the major landmarks and I'm asking for the land between this area. So each rancho was unique in its size and its shape and where its location, where it was here in Southern California.
Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas was roughly about 4,600 acres. And it's roughly stayed the same as what the boundaries are today of the city of Beverly Hills.
Maria Valdez and her husband, when they came to settle their little rancho, named it the Rodeo de las Aguas, which is the meaning of gathering of the waters from the tributaries of little streams that came out of the hills, now known as Cohota Canyon and Benedict Canyon. Day-to-day life on the rancho in the early 19th century in California was a very quiet and isolated one. Most of the rancho people built an adobe house, usually, if they could do this. They usually raised cattle. They had to harvest certain crops. They had kitchen gardens. It was a very pleasant life here in California. The weather was usually good.
The Rancho de las Aguas was the central rancho in the area. There were a lot of other ranchos, but they seemed to come to Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas for the festivities. They had all the young people come and have fiestas and parties, and the women would cook all day long for the fiesta. And so it was a very festive gathering and very festive time.
Rancho economies were dependent primarily on cattle, but not on beef. Now that's intriguing to us today because our major value for a cow today or a steer is the meat. But in those days they didn't have refrigeration. Therefore it was the hides, the hoof, it was the horn, and it was the tallow or the fat from the cow or from the steer that was of the most valued to markets that could use those products. The economy of the ranchos in California was largely tied to Asia. Many of the products that were produced on cattle ranches here were sent to Asia to be refined into leather chairs or leather boxes or other types of fineries that then were sent back into the Americas through the Philippines, through the Manila galleons that constantly moved between Acapulco and the Philippines.
Maria's family really was quite a large one, which was typical of the settlers in those days. She came from a very large family, but when her husband died, he left her with 8 children and a giant rancho of more than 4,500 acres of land here to deal with, to protect, and to cultivate.
For a widow with many children to raise, operating a rancho was too much. Maria Rita wrote her cousin in Spain, asking him to come and help her run the Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas. In return, she offered him half of the rancho. Maria would soon regret her tender, because her cousin was not a scrupulous man. He tried to force Maria Rita off the rancho altogether. She took action, petitioning Pio Pico, the governor of California, to intervene and force her cousin to leave. The governor agreed with Maria Rita.
She had to pay the cousin for the half of the property back, and she did. She paid him all of $17.50, which is what it was worth in those days.
There were 2 historical plaques dedicated to Maria Valdez being in the area. One is in Coldwater Canyon, and the other one, of course, is in Benedict Canyon, which denotes the Indian attack, which was the last straw.
There were a number of attacks on poor Maria Rita Valdez's rancho, and this one was the worst.
As the Indians stormed the rancho, Maria Rita's only son snuck out and ran to the neighboring town of Sherman, which is today West Hollywood. There, he rallied the other ranchers who drove off the Indian attackers. 3 Indians were killed, and the spot is marked with a stone marker at the corner of Chevy Chase and Benedict Canyon.
Maria Rita sold her rancho not only because of this threat of an Indian attack, which really was past, but really because of the terrible drought in the mid-19th century here, and eventually she sold to her neighbors.
While life on the ranchos may have been idyllic for many, it was not to be long-lived. Great changes, including American immigration, the Mexican-American War, and the California Gold Rush, would soon sweep away the life that Maria Rita Valdez so treasured.
Because of the unique problems of California, though, Americans had to figure out how to take the land away from people who already owned it. California Indians, the Mexicans, and the Spanish who legally owned California found themselves in the wrong end of a very brutal process.
Maria Rita Valdez was moved to sell her Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas to developers. These businessmen would see many failures before ultimately creating the City of Beverly Hills. From 1822 to 1854, Dona Maria Rita Valdez owned and operated the Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas, which encompassed the area now known as Beverly Hills. However, a series of Indian attacks, coupled with a crippling drought that decimated her cattle herd, forced Maria Rita to sell her property. In 1854, Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas passed from Maria Rita Valdez to partners Benjamin Wilson and Henry Hancock. The future site of Beverly Hills sold for $1,000 in cash, with another $3,000 to be paid in the future. When Benjamin Wilson first arrived in California, he had been a trapper, an adventurer, and a military commander. A true Renaissance man, he would go on to found California's orange industry and serve as mayor of Los Angeles. Wilson married into a prominent Mexican family, and as with other Anglos of the time, Hispanicized his name, becoming Don Benito Wilson. Wilson's partner was Henry Hancock.
Henry Hancock was one of Los Angeles' early pioneers who owned very large properties of rancho land around the Wilshire district of Los Angeles today, and famously known as the La Brea Tar Pits. Wilson and Hancock needed to expand their ranches because they had very large herds of cattle. Also, they had a big wheat operation of 2,000 acres just in this area alone. So that is really the main reason why they needed some more acreage to buy.
A good first year gave way to several years of drought. Wilson and Hancock saw their crops dry up and their cattle herd dwindle.
They were going to sell their crops to all the new hotels that went up in the area in downtown Los Angeles. But they picked a very bad time because in 1863 and 1864, it's when the city had its worst drought. And all the water in this lush area, they thought dried up.
The entire Los Angeles basin suffered through a prolonged drought. Hopeless ranchers drove their cattle over the Palos Verdes cliffs and into the sea. In 1865, oil was discovered in California. Passion for oil gushed, and the state was flooded with oil companies. Benjamin Wilson saw this opportunity and formed the Pioneer Oil Company, which in turn secured the oil and mineral rights to the Rancho de las Aguas.
The Pioneer Oil Company were a group of businessmen and developers. You'll probably recognize the names. It was Benjamin Wilson, along with Phineas Banning, and Governor Downey, who was the governor of California at that time. They thought they'd make it big finding oil.
Finding no substantial amounts of oil, the Pioneer Oil Company sold off the remaining tracts of the rancho to Basque shepherds. A few years later, visionary Edward Preuss purchased the land to start a German city. Due to a lack of interest, in short order, this dream failed as well.
His German colony just never took hold, and he ended up moving further east and developing the town of Anaheim, which was his German colony.
By the 1880s, the population of Los Angeles had boomed. The former Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas was acquired by Henry Hamill and Charles Denker.
By the 1880s, the land was sold to Hamill and Denker, these two hoteliers from downtown Los Angeles, and they purchased each little parcel, parcel by parcel, putting together back again the old rancho lands.
It was a booming hotel, and they wanted this land so they could grow crops to make the food for the hotel.
Observers at the time described the area as one vast field of lima beans. The Hamill and Denker Ranch prospered. In the late 1880s, Hamill and Denker attempted to subdivide the property and form a new city, Morocco. This plan failed, and in the year 1900, oil fever again swept California. Hamill and Denker sold to a group of investors who formed the Amalgamated Oil Company. Once again, disappointment and failure. Unlike the investors who came before them, however, these shareholders, including Burton Green, had pockets deeper than the wells that came up dry. Reorganizing as a land company, they set out to create the ideal community, a place they would come to call Beverly Hills. Find out more about the history of the city of Beverly Hills by visiting the Beverly Hills Public Library. Additional historical information is available on the city's website at www.beverlyhills.org.